What most interests you about the Greeks? How does it that you got inspired?
Right.
What draws you in?
Well, I think the most fascinating thing about the Greeks is that they showed consciousness of human life rather than just living life. I mean, other civilizations contemporary with the Greeks, they obviously left a record of their existence, yet they did not have the consciousness about their existence that we find in the literature and the art of the Greeks. And that, of course, makes all the difference because that's what starts the West off on its remarkable development.
So by that you mean?
Let me get a glass of water in here real quick for our guests.
That's great. I love what you said.
Sorry.
That's good. Just
He's a little.
a dart. You know,
Let me get a glass.
none of the other records, like with that, will catch up with us.
Right.
None of the other records of human activity that's preserved prior to this are referring to the self-reflexiveness.
Exactly.
The self-talk
Exactly.
story that's
Exactly.
going on the inside.
Exactly.
What's empowering this change.
That's right. That's right. Or, I mean, it's one thing to leave a record of something, such as Pharaoh putting up a big stele that says, on this spot I slew X number of whatever. It's another thing to ask what it means to do that. And it's only the Greeks that you have a record of asking that question.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Just for me, have a sip.
Okay.
Appreciate your attention, Renee. Wonderful.
I do what I can.
I appreciate this distinction a lot.
Mm-hmm.
At another dimension of this work, people generally recognize the significance and importance of coming into language.
Right.
But I make a distinction between language as an instrument,
Mm-hmm.
external instrumental
Mm-hmm.
extension,
Mm-hmm.
and when it flips back around to become this self-reflexive
Exactly.
mirror, that we're now holding up to compare and talk
Exactly.
about and think about everything.
Exactly.
You're saying that in the intersection of that, where it first really appears in the historical record.
That's right, is with the Greeks. And, people always, standard answer is, well, what's so special about the Greeks? And you say, well, they invented history, they invented philosophy, they invented tragedy. But that requires another question, which is, well, why did they invent all these things? And those are formalized expressions of exactly what we're talking about, this self-reflexive, I call it in my book, critical consciousness. And again, you can look in the Old Testament, you can look in the writings from Egypt, from Mesopotamia, anywhere else in the world that you want to look, from 6th, 5th century BC, and you're not going to find that. You're not going to find that level of, you might even say, abstraction that typifies the Greeks.
And what do you attribute the cause factor for how they became?
Well, if you could answer that question, that's the $60,000 question. I mean, the answers range from climate to all sorts of things. But in terms of what we're talking about today, surely the Greek alphabet and the Greek language is a very important factor in that development. Not the sole, obviously, but clearly an important one.
Yeah, one of the co-committing, co-influencing
Exactly.
forces. David Abram, the book that I refer to, he does make the point that it's the alphabet's abstractness.
Right.
It lends itself, or promotes a kind of cognitive abstraction which gives rise to
Sure.
self-reflection.
Sure.
And without being as unitary as you or I might like,
Right.
nonetheless, it's definitely a fundamental causative influencing factor in all of
Oh, absolutely. And it's a feedback loop because the greater sophistication of the language allows greater sophistication of thought, which demands greater sophistication of language, and then they just feed on each other. And it's not arithmetical, it's a geometrical progression. And you see that clearly just from Homer, let's say, about 750 BC, down to Plato and Aristotle in the 4th century. You can see in that record that sort of development going on.
So you can see the transition from significantly less verbal self-reflection
Right.
to significantly more verbal self-reflection, coincident with the coming in of the alphabet.
Sure, absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. Maybe you could phrase that in a way, because I don't want to use my voice.
Well, let's see. Once you create an alphabet that allows you to be more specific and exact and precise, as the Greeks do. Then you have an ability to articulate what might arise mentally. And then that in turn will demand the creation of another word, which you can do because you have an alphabet that is conducive to that sort of development, because it's sophisticated enough to do that. And then it just, they feed on each other, right? And so the sort of abstract philosophical terms for being, for example, the metaphysical, a notion of existence as an abstraction, you find that well, you find it in the 5th century, actually. You see it first in Parmenides in the mid-5th century. And so just in that mere 200 years between Homer, let's say, in the 5th century, you have this development happening. And part of it, I mean, there's a lot of factors that go into all this, obviously, but clearly the language, the written language, is a critical factor in this process. And if you ask, well, why doesn't it happen other places? There's a lot of reasons for that, and I want to make sure not to discount the political dimension of all this also, which I think is critical. But clearly, it's simply the suppleness and the exactitude of the alphabet, of the writing, of the language. That's a key factor.
And the alphabet arrives in Greece from the Phoenicians.
Exactly. Somewhere between 750 and 800 BC. The earliest artifacts, which are simple little inscriptions on an artifact that would say this belongs to so-and-so, or the famous Nestor cup, called the Nestor cup because it seems to resemble one described in the Iliad by Homer. There'll be a little short sort of statement inscribed on it. And those sorts of artifacts are dated from around that period. And so Homer is generally dated within that time period. Now, different scholars will want to push that back or push it forward. Some people want to go as early as 850 or as late as 700, but I think the consensus estimate is around 750 BC.
And within a few centuries of this, there's a significant change that happens to the Greeks.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Give me a sense of the before and after.
Sure. Well, in the period that we call the Dark Age, and we only say that because there's no writing, and that's the period between the fall of the Mycenaean palace centers in the 12th century and the emergence of city-state culture, which, let's say, is happening somewhere around the same time period. What's happened? You've developed a style of fighting in heavily armored infantrymen rather than in chariots or cavalrymen on horseback. You have colonization going on all over the Mediterranean. The Greeks are ending up on the Black Sea, they're ending up in North Africa, they're ending up in southern France, southern Spain, Sicily, southern Italy. You have increased trade across the Mediterranean, generally finished products moving to the west and raw materials, hides, ores, and of course the great commodity of the ancient world, human beings, slaves, moving the other direction. And you have the development of writing, of course, what we're talking about, and then you have the development of consensual governments, which is the critical development. That is, a rule will not be aristocratic clans who jockey and compete and ally to control the government, but there will be citizens who rule themselves through agreed upon protocols, laws, procedures, through offices that have expectations about responsibilities, duties, term limits, all those sorts of things. And so, that marks the real sort of beginning of what you can call the Greek miracle. Because the notion of individual freedom, even though it's defined in such a limited sense at this time, of course, for citizens, nonetheless, once you let that genie out of the bottle, you're not going back. People who acquire a notion of individual freedom, it's very difficult, short of overwhelming force and compulsion to get them to turn back from that.
So the Greeks were already spreading out
Right.
their empire before they received the alphabet.
Oh, yes. Yeah. And in fact, that encountering the alphabet is most likely a consequence of trade.
With the Phoenicians.
Right. That's right. Because the great, of course, crossroads for trade from the east was the coast of what is today Lebanon and Israel, and that's where the Phoenician cities like Tyre and Sidon, and the Greeks always had what they called emporia, little communities that lived there and that were sort of go-betweens for their merchants and the peoples, trading, the middlemen. And you can imagine these cities with all of these different ethnic groups, languages, religions, this ferment of various cultures. And we imagine, at some point, some Greeks or several, looking at the Phoenicians using this alphabet mainly for, inventory, record keeping, that sort of thing, and thinking, hey, we can tweak this a little bit and we can use it to write Greek. And then before you know it, within a couple hundred years, you have Homer, which is some of the most magnificent, complex literature ever written.
Did the Greeks have a writing system before this?
What they had before, during the Mycenaean period, was they used the Cretan alphabet in order to write Greek, so-called Linear B. But all that has remained is basically inventory, which is what writing pretty much serves most places. Writing is a very limited tool used by power to inventory, goods that come in, tribute that comes in, that sort of thing. And that's pretty much what the Greeks did. So the surviving writing isn't really interesting. You don't have anything poetic or anything along the lines of Homer. Records of temples, offerings brought in, who owes what to whom. And it's a very narrow little guild of scribes who have this knowledge and who work for, the king of this palace center. So when those collapsed, of course, that guild, that trade sort of goes with it, disappears with it. And there's no need to write because the institution that had used writing for its own administration now has disappeared.
Again, it was an external instrument of rather than mode of sharing.
No,
the richness level that we all take for granted.
That's right. It was mainly just keeping track of things.
So do you as a historian make a kind of line in the sand that says there was a oral culture Greek and then there's a written culture Greek?
No, I don't. I think that's misleading. I think that there is a gradual influence of literacy on the larger culture, but there's a lot of time in which these coexist and actually complement each other. There are, for example, in the historical record, officials their names are sort of rememberers. Even after the period of writing, it's still their job to remember certain details, certain information to complement what is written.
So the official librarian bard.
Sort of.
Keep track of.
Yeah, for a contract, for example, a contract would have several witnesses, and the memory of those witnesses would be as critical as the bare bones sort of details of the agreement, which don't have a lot of information. So there's a long period at which they complement each other. And I think a second point it's important to remember is Greek culture, even through the period of high literacy, is still very much a public oral culture. It's not. We're not talking about writing in our experience as private, silent reading at home. Like, we're talking about public declamation. We're talking about people hearing other people speak or read aloud, or on the tragic stage, deliver lines. So given those conditions, the sort of oral culture is going to continue to flourish, and literacy in some senses will be sort of subordinate or a helper to that oral culture rather than a sort of taking over from it and driving it away. Exactly.
Yes, up until relatively recent, even in the history of writing, the alphabet was used primarily as a cue for speech.
Yes.
Oral, external, outspoken
Right.
speech, not internal.
Right. Right.
So one of the things that interested me as I read this is that there seems to be quite a progression of thought about all this just between these three great characters, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle.
Mhm.
They represent a view of the spectrum of shit
Right.
that's happening in
Right.
themselves, even though they're back to back, so to speak.
Right, because Socrates, of course, looks upon writing, if we can judge from what Plato tells us he says, looks upon writing, sort of askance, and writes nothing himself and leaves no written record. And then, of course, Plato's great contribution is through these really literary creations. We tend to think of philosophy as a dry sort of academic discipline, but that's a modern sort of development. In the ancient world, philosophy was a literary genre, and the dialogues are this sort of literary recreation of spoken conversations.
So a form of mental excitement and entertaining excitement that's not just, like you said, as we look back on it today,
Right.
this dry philosophical.
No. I mean, it's the whole notion of people getting together in a public space and talking about the most important issues that humans have to face. And we're back to that self-reflexiveness or that critical consciousness. It's a kind of script for this activity to sort of memorialize it. Again, the literary is not taking the place of the oral. It is really kind of still subservient to it, even as a pretense.
Which
Right.
of course, is what Aristotle's saying, in effect, isn't he? He's basically saying that's just the spoken made visible.
Exactly. And so you have this dramatic situation that Plato imagines with Socrates and his interlocutors, and then the dialogue is simply memorialization of that. And you imagine that many of the people, or I would imagine that many of the people who would have read that or heard it read, maybe possibly had been present at the original sort of conversation. And I think the great example of this is the Protagoras, which is a wonderful dialogue about the sophist Protagoras, who believes in giving set speeches or lectures. And of course, Socrates believes in the dialectic, the question and answering, that you have to have a dynamic interchange between people. And so, it's like Fraser and Ali. We have to get these two together, and Plato's dramatization of that moment that he recreates is wonderful. It's dramatic, it's literary, it's not just philosophical, but it is public and it is oral. It's people speaking with other people sitting around listening.
Yeah, Socrates said that writing was a ghost, a shadow.
Sure.
Not in itself
Yeah.
real. It had no
Yeah.
vitality like a living
Exactly.
word that was exchanged between living beings. And it was a bad place for society to
Right.
go. It was just like
Right.
that's a tract in nowhere. They'll stay out of that.
Well, that's interesting because, in education today, there's, at higher education, is a cost sort of control idea that we can videotape professors and students can access them online or through videotapes. And my argument, as always, and I'm sort of a Luddite in that regard, is that, but it's exactly the argument Socrates makes. You're missing what happens when a live human being is in a room with other live human beings, and there's all sorts of stuff going on there, and that is very difficult to communicate once you put the camera in between. Just probably I shouldn't bring that point up in this.
That's the dynamic affective pressure.
That's exactly right.
People
Yeah.
Is entirely different than the
Yeah.
picture. Not to mention the fact that until such time as we can index this stuff well enough so that somebody
Right.
can travel into it and get what you said about some particular thing at
Right.
a granularity level that answers their particular
Right.
learning needs,
Right.
then it's still like sitting
Yeah.
there listening to a lecture or reading a book,
That's
and
right.
still not addressing what's needed.
That's right. Yes.
You know, that chair kind of slopes back.
Oh, does it?
Maybe a little less comfy. There you go. That's better.
Okay.
I found this quote which I shared with you prior to setting this up, from Plato, where he says, "Just as in learning to read, I said we are satisfied when we knew the letters of the alphabet." I'll give you a chance to expound on that a little bit if you can. But what I took that to mean, and I may be taken out of context, that's why I like talking to somebody who's put their head in the
Well, I'm afraid that I'm not recognizing that the context of that
Okay.
quote.
Is there any other time in which Plato talked about the process of learning to read, or any Greek that you know of talked about the process of learning to read?
Not that I can think of offhand.
Okay. All right. My point about this was that the Greeks added vowels.
Right. Right.
They did not have punctuation.
Right.
It's my understanding from listening to Seneca and others talk about the Greek stuff that has been inherited by Rome.
Right.
It was just all this run together mess.
Right. No
Yeah.
space between
No
words.
space between words.
Right.
No, it was just endless.
Oh, and various directions that the writing went. The boustrophodon, which means ox turning, it's like an ox plowing. It goes to the end and then he turns and plows this way. So instead of going back to the beginning, you go this way. You know, right? And some of these coexisting at the same time. Some going like that. Some going back and forth. Again, no small or capital letters, no punctuation, no space between words. Right. So it's
Challenge.
yes.
But while they had whatever challenge goes with that, they had a pretty fresh alphabet. Where evidently, anyway, they've mapped over the Phoenician alphabet with the addition of vowels, so that the distinct sounds heard in their language all had one and only one letter to correspond to them. So what I took Plato to mean here, not that I want you to go where you don't want to go or can't go, was that in their day, reading the alphabet was see the letter, say the sound.
Right.
It's fast, it blends together, you're talking.
Right.
And that the subsequent problems that we face happen further down the road. Anything that you can say that anywhere intersects that point that you're comfortable with?
I'm sorry, I'm letting you down here.
No problem, no problem. So did Plato have anything else to say about writing or reading that you think would...
Well, you know, the problem with Plato is the relationship to Socrates and Socrates' philosophy, which is a quite complicated, issue. And so, for example, in the Phaedrus, the sort of, bad things that Socrates has to say about Phaedrus' little manuscript that he's carrying around, and dismissing that raises the question of, is this Plato recreating Socrates' view, which, given that Socrates doesn't write, and in other places, dismisses writing, could be the case, or is it Plato's own view? I seriously doubt it's Plato's own view, because Plato writes so much, and we have to remember we only have a little bit of what he wrote. There's so much that he wrote that was lost, so much that Aristotle wrote that is lost. So it'd be hard to imagine that he could have such a distrust of writing when it's so necessary for his educational activities in the academy. In other words, that students have to take notes, for example, of lectures, that these are very important sort of learning tools. But again, I can't pass myself off as an expert on Plato, let alone Plato's, views of writing. So, right, but I can't imagine
the
that.
argument that what did Socrates really say, and what's a Plato projection?
Well, right,
Put all
yeah.
over the place, right?
Yes, of course. That's.
But because it was necessary for Plato to have an academy and to conduct himself
Right.
as a writer, it was really clear that writing was a central part of everything he was doing.
Absolutely.
And yet it's still, there's the radiation from Socrates through that work of Socrates' disdain and disapproval of it.
Right. And yet, and also though, in that educational activity, there is still a spoken sort of important dimension to it. And still, the writing is important, but perhaps one could speculate, would Plato really want an educational process that was all writing? And, you know, my instinct is to say no. Again, writing has increased in importance, but there's still that communal oral sort of aspect to it that has to take priority.
The question that cuts in here is whether or not the atomistic nature of the alphabet lent itself to the atomistic thinking of Platonic ideals and Aristotelian logic and you know, the other things that have this congruency with this idea of these separate, discrete,
sure,
elements like the alphabet, which all these things are colliding
right
together.
I would even say not just at the letter, maybe at the level of the letter, but the level of syntax, of you know, the way language works, grammar. Clearly, consciousness about those issues and speculation and treatises on those issues are going on at the same time that these other philosophical developments are happening as well. And clearly, each one supports the other. Analysis of ideas has to work through analysis of words and of language, and of everything that involves, including shades of meaning, alternative meanings, even etymologies, which, you know, Plato is fascinated with, syntax, all of those sorts of issues. So they're really intertwined. I mean, I think it's impossible to separate the development of one from the other.
How are we doing on time, Renee, as far as tape switch?
26 in, we got about 5 minutes left.
So as this writing system developed, it spread throughout the Greek Empire as a mechanism of communication between the outposts.
Well, certainly it had that function, but one of the problems that we face is the absence of evidence. And as much as we have from ancient Greece, and as brilliant as that much is still a very little bit of what must have been produced by the Greeks. And so, in terms of geographical sort of dispersion, there's accidents of survival and accidents of transmission. Given that papyrus is so perishable, you know, outside of dry climates such as in the Middle East, it's hard to generalize about the extent and the dispersion of writing, you know, throughout the Greek world, because various concentrations that we have, such obviously from Athens, could reflect historical circumstances or simply accidents of transmission. You see what I mean? So it's hard to say. One can imagine, though, that given the increasing commercial activity and diplomatic activity between Greek city-states with each other, the Persian Empire, the various other parts of the Greek world, writing has to be a critical factor in that increased activity. Inscriptions, you know, which, especially those on stone, which are more, you know, survive more, I think is an indication of that.
For example, in the case of the Roman Empire, we know there was almost a linguistic colonization that they imposed their oral and written language.
That's right.
Everybody that they took over, so to speak.
That's right.
Provided them the infrastructure of the network.
That's right. The administration. Yeah.
I guess what I'm asking is, do you think there was a parallel between that and the Greeks, or the Greeks had some other mechanism or modality?
Well, I think the difference with the Greeks is they didn't really have an empire. I mean, you know, you have what, maybe 1,000 city-states scattered all over the Mediterranean from east to west,
so they
independent.
Didn't impose any central control
No,
or communication.
no,
It was just a loose confederation.
That's right. That's right. Yes.
Let's change now. So in the second part, what I'd like to do, building more on your book, which unfortunately I haven't read, is to say something about
circumstances or simply accidents of transmission. You see what I mean? So it's hard to say. One can imagine, though, that given the increasing commercial activity,
Doing okay there? Got enough water?
yeah, I'm good, thanks. I'm good.
So like I said, I'd like to move from this kind of interior process to the more outbound sense of how is it the Greeks were.
Right.
And before we do that, if there's anything else now, having kind of covered this preliminary space,
Right.
that you feel like we could do better or we could hit again or something, you're fine.
I'm good. You're doing a good job.
Thanks. Let's move on then.
Sure.
How did the Greeks create Western civilization in your bigger sense of it?
Well, let's go from the other direction and say what are the fundamental elements that constitute the West? And so we say one, for example, rationalism. Now, this is not to say that other peoples couldn't think rationally, but again, rationalism as systematic, as being conscious of the activity of reason and inventing a language to transcribe that activity, to systematize it. This is a unique invention of the Greeks. And this connects with another important development, that is to see the world naturally rather than supernaturally. And the greatest example of this is in medical writings, because from ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia, you have lots and lots of surviving medical writings, and they're very systematic, right? Very organized, but when the day is done, they're really about demon management, because all disease is a question of demons. And it really, you look at the Hippocratic corpus, that group of writings, of Greek medical writings that were collected under the name of the Dr. Hippocrates, and you start to get the idea that disease is a natural phenomenon, the human body is a natural phenomenon, and if we pay attention to the conditions of life, the conditions of sickness, what goes in the body, what comes out, what sort of environment a patient lives in, what direction do the winds come from, all of this empirical sort of natural observation, then you will arrive at a better diagnosis than you would if you're consulting these traditional records of how a demon was cast out previously. And then you jump ahead 2,500 years, and of course our remarkable medicine is the ancestor of that way of looking at disease. So rationalism is one important, even perhaps more important. The idea of freedom is invented by the Greeks. And there you discriminate between what I call de facto freedom, which any group of people with young males with weapons, they're going to be free because there's no way not for them to be free. So I'm not talking about just the accident of being free. I mean the idea of freedom as a concept that you can think about and analyze. That first arises among the Greeks. And then from there connects to notions of how do we guarantee it, incorporate it, institutionalize it, right? And it's connected to language, obviously, and a great example is our very important concept of free speech, right? There is no word for free speech anywhere in the 5th century BC except in Greek, which has 2 words for free speech. So the concept and the word and the reality, all, as we've been talking, all have to sort of coexist and influence each other. And then third, or did you remember?
So relative to that, just for my
Yeah.
clarification, less for the tape, what we're saying is that the idea of holding the intention of being free for others, for a group of us, for society, rather than for who could fight their way to freedom
Exactly.
by power.
Exactly.
To actually hold it as an ideal for us,
right.
for an usness.
Yeah, and us is going to be very narrowly defined at the beginning.
Sure.
You know, it's going to be the citizens of my city-state, which are going to be the free males.
There's a dialogue
right.
incubator to extend the boundaries of freedom to
There
others.
you go. But like we said, once you let the idea out, it's a matter of time. And it takes a long time. You get to our world today where we all believe that every individual should be free, that it's a condition of our humanity. Freedom is a condition of our humanity. But that's not a natural sort of idea. You know, that's an idea that has to be invented, right? And it's the Greeks who invented. Then the third important foundation of our world is politics. Politics, obviously, it's a Greek word from the polis, the city-state. The idea that men should not be ruled by other men through force, but by virtue of some sort of consensual agreement of laws, of procedures, of protocols, right, which are going to depend more and more on the written word to codify and memorialize these, to make them less arbitrary. And again, when it starts, it's only for the citizens of this one city-state. I mean, the Athenians have no compunctions about enslaving other Greeks. There's no sense that this is for everybody. It's for us. And citizenship can be defined very narrowly, as in Sparta, as only a tiny percentage of all the human beings alive in the territory, or most broadly in Athens, which still means only maybe about 40% of all the human beings alive. But that's not really the issue. What's miraculous is that it is even invented at all, because you do not have politics outside of Greek city-states. What you have is rule by tiny elites who monopolize force, monopolize resources, and everyone else is a subject. So the Greeks give us the idea of the citizen rather than the subject, the idea of politics rather than mere rule. And that, of course, is the political ideal of our society, of every Western society, and all those other societies in the world who aspire to that same condition. So I identify those three as the important foundation blocks of our world, and whose origins lie among the Greeks.
Zeroing back to something that you mentioned on the part two
Mm-hmm.
of that, part of the politics of memorializing things,
Right.
codifying things.
Right.
What codification system was used before there was an alphabet to codify it?
Where? In Greece?
Yeah.
We don't know.
Right.
So
the basis for codification as we do know it, which
Sure.
is so central to
Sure.
so many things, is
it has to, yeah.
is a product of the alphabet.
Right, right. I mean, some things you could, for example, if a piece of land is mortgaged, you can just put a stone on it, right? And the stone means this land is mortgaged, right? But apart from that, what else are you going to do? And even those eventually have writing on them of some sort, right?
With respect to developing some kind of a memorializing understanding of what the collective political intention is, or working out legislation, or anything that's
Right.
that's,
Right. The rules.
of it, as we talk about,
Right.
those kind of things are all organized with
Right.
the tool of the alphabet.
That's right. And then when you get to more complex political activity, as in the city-states of the later 5th century, diplomacy, treaties, edicts, the Athenian assembly, every edict is passed has to be memorialized in writing as a public record. Then it becomes even more critical, and it coexists with and facilitates, I think, the increasing complexity of domestic and foreign activity on the part of city-states. One goes hand in hand with the other, and one doesn't make the other possible. I don't think it's that simplistic. But there's that fascinating, complementary.
In in the case of
reinforcement.
Of the codification and classification systems, until there was some kind of a tree to provide order to hang things on, it seems that that was more causally enabling.
Right.
In that context.
Right. Right.
Maybe you could say that instead of me, if you agree.
Well, you have, you could rely on, the memory of everybody who was there. You have an assembly. Let's imagine the beginning of Homer's Iliad, that great book 1, where you have an assembly of all the Greek fighters, and Agamemnon and Achilles have their quarrel. Well, what memorializes that? But simply what everybody heard, and you can imagine what sort of worms that are going to come out of that can. So obviously, yes, once you get to the point where you can, because you have a written language adequate to the complexity of the sort of legislation that's coming out, as comes out of the, let's say, the assembly in Athens, then it does make it possible to go to other levels of political activity, whether in terms of your relations with other city-states or with the Persian Empire or whatever, right? Because you do have this record. And I think an example of this that you'll see is in trials, the records of trials that have come down, where they will refer to a law, and then the law will be read in the court, right? And it appears in the record of the defense speech that the orator has written for this particular case. And then the law will be read. Right? Well, clearly you're not going to do that unless you have the tool to record those, and you can bring it in, and the clerk or whatever he's called can stand up during the trial and say, yeah, this is the law, and then read it out.
Which requires some kind of indexing, which requires some...
Somehow, yes. Yeah, retrieval, yeah. Sure, of course, of course, of course.
Anything else on the outbound side?
Well, again, self-consciousness, I think, is the key. And perhaps another corollary is individualism, the sense of individuals arising out of collectives, or not my clan or my sect, but me. This individual person, these individual thoughts, this personality, these perceptions. And you see this, for example, on the tragic stage, where you get the figure of the tragic hero, an Oedipus or an Ajax, or this individual sort of person. You can even see it in vase painting, where the earlier crowded sort of scenes of many, many, many people, by the later 5th century, you're now getting that one figure of the athlete or the warrior or whatever, or one or two. This greater sense of individual personality, which of course, again, is what conditions all of our thinking. We take for granted as just the way it is, and of course, let's say 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, that's not the way it was. The interesting question is, how does language and writing sort of feed into that? And I think there's one example from ancient Greece that you can look at, and that's lyric poetry. Lyric poetry that arises in the 7th, 6th century BC, where you now have a poet such as Sappho saying Sappho in the poem, right? And it's not a strict autobiographical, obviously, record. She now is a character that is created and put into this poem, right? And there's a beautiful example of that self-consciousness and reflexiveness we're talking about, where she now looks upon herself through this name that appears in this poem, right? And you have other examples of that, and it's, I'm feeling sexual passion. What does this mean? How does this affect me, right? What does this do to me, right? This individual personality. And that's what's fascinating about that right after Homer is that kind of poetry.
Yeah, we've got this almost more collective consciousness with these godlike archetypal polarities in it, to this individualistic, elemental,
right,
that lines up with the emergence of individualism, as you're talking about, the need to organize individuals together in the politics.
That's right.
And then the alphabet just maps right onto that, as does the emergence of Plato's ideas and the science of atoms and all the rest of it
Right.
that we were so
Right.
built on.
I think that perhaps the most general way that we could put it that pretty much covers everything, including written language, is a fine old Greek word, analysis. You know, the breaking down and putting back together conceptually, right, in an organized fashion. And I mean, that's even in terms of lyric poetry about sexuality, it's really analytical. You know, Sappho has unfortunately, 2 poems of Sappho has survived. But one of them is, she's talking about the impact of sexual passion on herself. And it's almost like a clinical diagnosis as she goes through each of her senses and says, this is what happens to my eyes, this is what happens to my tongue, this is what happens to my, right? It's an analysis, right? An analysis of this experience rather than just recording the experience, but breaking it apart. You see what I mean? And saying, now what? Right?
Which is this
Exactly.
distance
That's right.
comes in with the self-reflection.
That's right.
I think we're done. Anything else you want to add? Anything I didn't ask that you think is relevant to this space?
Oh, I mean, I think you covered it pretty well.
All right.
Yeah,
So did you.
good questions.
Thank
Yeah.
you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. It's fun. Hope it helps.
Yep, that's exactly what we needed. This David Abrams book, I think you'll find it really fascinating.